About chapter 28, section 3, and it's called The Great Society because this is Lyndon Johnson's great hope that the demand for reform would create a new awareness of social problems, especially on matters of civil rights and the effects of poverty in our country.
Lyndon Baines Johnson had a personality as big as his home state of Texas. As president, he faced challenges that were tougher than a bad batch of barbecue.
You are right.
In the tradition of FDR and JFK, Johnson was another three-initial president, and he was big on his initials. From Johnson's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, to his dog, Little Beagle Johnson, the White House was overflowing with LBJs. Unfortunately, the LBJ's move from the vice presidential quarters to the big house came at a tragic time for America. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, leaving the country stunned and grieving. Sworn in as president just hours after Kennedy was shot, Johnson had big dreams for America.
In your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society.
Johnson's Great Society programs included help for the poor, funding for the arts, and environmental protection. He also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, making it illegal in America to discriminate against someone based on his or her race or sex.
He grew up in an area where there was great poverty. He was a teacher, and he taught in a school largely made up of Mexican-American students. And he always kept that in mind, that it was more than just a racial issue. It was also an economic issue.
Lyndon Johnson was the best civil rights president of all time. He, in fact, said, I'm going to make Kennedy's issues my issues, and he, in fact, is responsible for the major civil rights laws that we got passed. He's the president who signed them.
For the civil rights movement, it was a Texas-sized step in the right direction.
Lyndon Johnson did lots of good things for people in the country, but he started escalating the Vietnam War and didn't explain it, wasn't fully candid about what was going on.
Until peace comes, or if it does not come, our course is clear. We will act as we must to help protect the independence of the valiant people of South Vietnam.
Johnson upheld the commitment Kennedy had made to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But more and more Americans were protesting the war. And by 1968, 30,000 Americans had died, along with hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, with no end in sight. So why did Johnson stay the course?
At the time, this country was deathly afraid of communism. And so most Americans, not just Lyndon Johnson, the president, thought it was a necessary thing to do. But had he been able to see the outcome, he wouldn't have done it.
By election time, all the good Johnson had done was overshadowed by the pain America had suffered over Vietnam. LBJ knew that a fight for re-election would likely be a losing battle.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
One of the things Lyndon Johnson taught not just me, but I think everyone, was something he said, which was this: when you're president of the United States, doing what's right is not hard. Knowing what the right thing to do is hard.
LBJ's initials might well have been LTL for larger than life. He definitely left a big impression on the presidency.
Lyndon Johnson was an amazing person in a number of ways. He grew up in a poor family. He worked his way through college as a janitor. He went on to become a teacher at a largely low-income school made up of primarily Mexican-American children. And his experiences as a young person shaped his passions as a politician. By 1955, he was the Senate Majority Leader for the Democratic Party. And he had a tenacious personality. They called him the Bulldog because he could pressure people into getting things done. He knew how to play the dirty game of politics. He had dirt on almost every single legislator, which enabled him to get those hundreds of laws passed when he was president. And when Kennedy was up for election in 1960, Johnson helped bring in a lot of those southern states that were on the fence because of the civil rights issues, because of his and Kennedy's passions for the civil rights cause. Now, when the war on poverty was unveiled, there were a lot of major pieces to this. First off was a tax cut, which would spur economic growth. The idea here is that it would increase investment into the private sector and that it would actually stimulate the tax revenue for the federal government and in turn lower the deficit. Another one of the key pieces of legislation by Lyndon Johnson was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We'll spend more time in chapter 29 talking about that. And his great passion was this war on poverty. And so part of this was the Economic Opportunity Act. Johnson believed that everyone, regardless of race, creed, national origin, socioeconomic status, deserve an equal opportunity in life, an equal opportunity to advance themselves. And this manifested through funding for education, for training, for small business loans. It resulted in the creation of the Job Corps, which is a job training program. We've got several here locally. There's a branch of it right here on our campus. Of Head Start, that is federally funded child care programs to give pre-K education to our youth. Because the reality is that pre-K education helps to prepare our young children for their education. Those who have it come in more prepared. Those who cannot afford it are sometimes struggling from the very beginning. And then community action programs like the WCCA that I talked about, which you can find. I think we've got one actually right here on campus, a WCCA child care program. You walk by it in the parking lot.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
A war against poverty was the war that Johnson really wanted to fight. In his first State of the Union address, he reached back to the populism of his father and grandfather. He took a Kennedy anti-poverty proposal and made it his own.
It will not be a short or easy struggle, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it.
When Lyndon Johnson became president, 35 million Americans were living below the poverty line in the most affluent country in the world.
And I said, but they don't vote. They don't have any organized lobbies. How in the world are you going to get any substantial legislation on poverty? Jack Kennedy couldn't. How are you going to do it? He leaned back and he said, and these words engraved on my memory, he said, I don't know whether I'll pass a single law or get a single dollar appropriated, but before I'm through, no community in America is going to be able to ignore the poverty in its midst.
Johnson now turned to the director of the Peace Corps, Sergeant Schreiber.
One Saturday morning, he called me up and said that his radio show, which he had every Saturday, was going to go on in a couple of hours, and he wanted to announce on that show that I was going to be the new head of the war against poverty, or the head of the new war against poverty. And I said, well, Mr. President, really, I haven't had a chance to speak to my wife. I haven't had a chance to talk to any people in my office. I don't know what they'll think about it in the Peace Corps. Couldn't you just postpone that? Frankly, I would rather talk to you about it next week. He said, well, now, Sergeant, he said, no, the truth is we've got to get on with that war against poverty. So please talk to Eunice now. Just talk to her now, and I'll call you back. So I put the phone down. I couldn't believe my ears. Next thing you know, the phone rang again. There was the president on it. He said, well, what did you decide? And I said, well, Mr. President, it would really be much better for me and my family if we could just talk about this next Monday or Tuesday and see what, I have a better idea of what you want me to do. And I'm afraid if you announce that I'm the head of the war of poverty, people ask me what I'm going to do about it, and I don't know. And that will be a source of embarrassment to me and maybe not so good for you. He said, well, Sarge, he said, I have this radio program. It's going on about an hour. Said, let me call you back. So he called me back about 20 minutes later, and in a very low voice.
Of this, and I love showing that scene, talking about this man who's like suddenly put in charge of it, because you get a sense of the personality of this president. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson was sworn in by emergency on Air Force One right after the president was assassinated. But he won an actual election in 1964. His opponent was the Republican Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater wanted to postpone these social spending programs and wanted to focus on the war in Vietnam. In fact, his plan was to begin bombing Vietnam automatically, which really made it a simple decision for a lot of Americans. LBJ won in a landslide. And so meanwhile, Southern Democrats were continuing to turn against the Democratic Party. Partly because of the Democrats' focus on social spending, but mostly on the civil rights issue. But even still, the Democrats here had the necessary majority to win the presidency. And so the Great Society was announced. This is Lyndon Johnson's legislation to end poverty. As you can imagine, a very ambitious, maybe even idealistic goal. Johnson was able to get Congress to pass 206 different laws related to this. And let's unpack some of these. For one, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act funded materials for public schools. In particular, opened up public high schools around the country. In regards to health care, Lyndon Johnson was the one who signed Medicare into law, which provides low-cost medical and hospital insurance for senior citizens. He was the one who signed Medicaid into law, which provides health insurance for those who cannot afford it. So, if your family cannot afford health care and it's provided for you, this is the man who made that possible. All right, so we've talked about education, we've talked about health care. What about housing? One of the basic needs of America's poor is for a safe and warm and comfortable place to sleep with their families. And so there were laws passed that, shifted money for public housing to low and moderate income areas. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was created under one of these laws with the War on Poverty. And also, regarding immigration, when the Bracero program came to an end in the Second World War, there was this really difficult time for a lot of migrant families in our country where they had been encouraged to come into the country. And now they found themselves in a climate where they were not wanted, where they were looked down upon, where they were treated as second class, and where much of what you read in the Grapes of Wrath came true for these families. And Johnson's plan to put an end to this was the Immigration Act of 1965, which put an end to quotas based on where people were coming from. Yes, there were quotas. X amount of people allowed from this country, X amount from this country, X amount from this country. Depending on your race, you may come in, or your race, you may not come in. And that's That's just wrong. And you know, it's discrimination. And so the Immigration Act of 1965 was created to put an end to that. But also in regards to the environment. Rachel Carson wrote a book, and I've got a copy if you want to borrow it, called Silent Spring, exposing the dangers of pesticides in our country. We drink filtered water. Go to the water fountain. That's filtered water. Cows do not. They drink from streams, from ponds. They are exposed to dangerous diseases and pesticides. We eat those cows. Indirectly, you consume those pesticides and those very same diseases that those animals are drinking. Same with produce, same with fruit. And so the Water Quality Act of 1965 was created, requiring states to clean up their rivers. The Pigeon River, just 1 hour from here, past Asheville, was once considered a dead ecosystem, unsafe even to wade into. It was so heavily polluted from the Blue Ridge Paper Company, then called Champion Paper Company in Canton. So polluted that you couldn't even wade in the water. You still shouldn't drink the water, obviously, but thanks to the Water Quality Act of 1965, as well as a collection of lawsuits based on this federal law requiring the paper company to clean up the river, fish are beginning to return. You can now safely swim in this river. Also, in regards to consumer protection, laws were set requiring labels on consumer products, requiring safer cars, safer food by federal law.
We've got the resources to help these people who are right at the bottom. For God's sakes, don't you understand that your interest, in effect he was arguing, your interest as a business leader is the welfare state because you keep everything stable? It must have been a very appealing argument to a corporate executive who was not to the right of Attila the Hun, that in a civilized country with such abundance as we have, astounding abundance compared to the rest of the world, you can afford to be liberal with the poor.
We were a generation of people who had been in World War II. So when a war against poverty was launched, it was typical of all of us at that time to think of this war, the war against poverty, in terms just like the war against Hitler. We were accustomed to thinking in terms of the United States being able to do big things. America bestrode the world like a colossus. There was nothing in the world equal to the United States of America.
The war on poverty was just part of Johnson's program for the country. Few anticipated that this coarse and abrasive Texan would propose a series of laws to enrich daily life for all Americans. He called his vision the Great Society.
The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community.
It was an inflated rhetoric,
It is a place where man can renew
the kind American leaders seldom use anymore.
It is a place which honors creation for its own sake.
As one aide described it, what he meant was a full stomach, yes, but a fuller life, too.
It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their gold than the quantity of their goods.
His aspirations were enormous. He wanted to do something for everyone. He wanted to be the best father Americans ever had. But in 1964, Johnson still thought of himself as standing in John Kennedy's shadow. He hated that he was merely an accidental president. He wanted to be elected president in his own right. The Republican Party was going to make it easy.
Now, when you have a string of Democratic presidents that of course means Supreme Court appointments, and it can shift the political spectrum of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren definitely moved the court to the left quite a bit. They ruled that the loyalty oaths under the McCarthy era were unconstitutional. Numerous cases affirming free speech and the separation of church and state. In addition to rules that reformed the way in which states redrew congressional districts. In fact, the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court has currently ruled that the state of North Carolina is drawing its congressional districts in an unconstitutional way. And by the order of the United States Supreme Court, North Carolina is having to come up with a different plan. And so these court rules require that districts are equally proportioned. And while these rulings were passed in the 1960s, what practice has shown, what history has shown, is that we still have problems with this. And so some of these landmark cases, and I believe they're listed on the second part of your notes there. Brown versus Board of Education ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. We'll spend a lot more time on this one in Chapter 29, but I just wanted to point out that this landmark case was passed during Lyndon Johnson's. It was passed in 1953, so it predated Johnson, but it was passed as a result of this Chief Justice Earl Warren. Secondly, Baker v. Carr established the principle of one person, one vote. And it asserted that federal courts had the right to tell states to reapportion districts for more equal representation, which, based on this precedent, the state of North Carolina, again, has been ordered by the United States Supreme Court to reapportion its districts in a more equitable way. And we'll talk about that more in civics economics, but just for example, the district that we live in was drawn to exclude Asheville, even though it's right next to us. And the purposes of that were to benefit a particular political party. And that's just one example of gerrymandering, of unfair drawing of congressional districts. And then finally, Mapp v. Ohio ruled that evidence seized illegally could not be used in state courts. This is also known as the exclusionary rule. So no longer can an officer allege that you have contraband if you were searched in an unconstitutional way. So no longer can an officer of the law say, you look sketchy, I'm going to search you. No, they have to prove to a judge to demonstrate probable cause and then get a warrant to search your personal property. The next three cases are also huge in regard to your personal rights. Gideon v. Wainwright required that criminal courts provide legal counsel to those who cannot afford it. You are entitled to representation. Even if you cannot afford it, it will be provided to you by the state. Officers are required to read that to you. Because of another case, Miranda v. Arizona. You must be informed of your rights if you are placed under arrest. If you are not, then due process has not been followed and you will get out on a technicality. And then finally, Escobedo v. Illinois. If you are questioned by an officer of the law, you have a right to have an attorney present. And if you cannot afford said attorney, you have a right for one to be provided to you by the state of North Carolina. Even if they ask you, hi, how you doing? I'll need a lawyer present. Well, that'd be rude. But if you feel uncomfortable answering a question to an officer, all you have to say is, I would like a lawyer present. And whether you can afford one or not is beside the point. They have to stop asking you questions at that moment. Again, by order of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the social and economic effects of this. The rate of poverty did drop in a measurable way. These tax cuts did spur the economy. the Great Society programs did cost an awful lot, which does raise an important debate over the effectiveness of programs like this, over whether or not the government should be involved in this type of role. Okay,